Okay, welcome everyone. Today we have an exciting discussion with our guest, Sidney. Sidney is someone who teaches research here as well to a different group of students, and he is my go-to stats guy. They tell you in the master's program to make friends with someone in statistics, and now I have found someone to be my go-to guy. And he's doing his PhD in the Human Studies program at Laurentian, and he's got a lot of research experience behind him and a lot more quantitative research experience than I have. So I have asked him to talk about quantitative research in particular today, and then we'll talk more about qualitative research on Monday. When you guys are working on your background, we talked about this last week, but just a reminder that you want to make sure that you're very interesting at the beginning and you hook your reader. So you don't want your first few sentences to be boring. I've given people feedback to improve their posts so far. We talked about this last week, just as a reminder that you start with the significance and relevance of your study, then you move to critiquing your research, then you have a clear problem statement, and today we're focusing on the problem and the purpose, and more so the purpose in quantitative research. I wanted to just remind everybody that when someone comments on your blog, whether it be myself or anybody else from the course, you have the option to approve or not approve the comments for public viewing. It's perfectly fine with me if you choose not to approve my posts. I did say to somebody in here that your peers might appreciate if you approve the things that they're saying, just so that it stays so that I can view it. But if there's something that somebody says and you don't want that on your website, then just don't approve their post. A couple of reminders from the blog posts and the Moodle postings that I've been reading so far. You need to remember to make sure that you use some literature. I know that you're blogging, but the rubric that you guys helped me create says that you need to use literature in those postings. Make sure that you're reading the progress to praxis section of the learning activities and that you include all the components. The biggest thing that was missing so far this week is that people would say some things, but then they wouldn't draft their purpose statement. So that was like the second bullet point. So make sure that you read past the first bullet point of what you're expected to do. Also, this is kind of a stylistic thing, but when I'm reading your papers, your posts, or listening to you talk on YouTube or whatever it is you're going to do, I don't need you to say the significance of the study is blah, blah, blah. I just need you to demonstrate significance. I should be essentially intelligent enough to pick up on your significance if it's clear enough in your writing without you saying it that way. And when it comes to expectations, blogging is a little bit more lenient than if you were writing a formal paper or something like that, but I may comment on some APA things just to give you some tips for when you do something more formal. And I also really appreciate the people who took a little bit of time to find a picture to go along with their posts or a video to go along with their posts or something, because that makes the blog a little bit more interesting. This week, you're going to take the purpose statements that you drafted last week, and you're going to refine them using the tips that Sidney and I are going to talk about today, and I'll talk some more about it Monday. I encourage everyone to look at the project plan rubric when they're doing this week's activity, because when you open it, you'll see there's criteria right in here for how to do your problem, your purpose, and your questions, and that would be really helpful for you when you're blogging, because it'll give you a head start on working on that project plan of yours. All right, Sidney, let's get into the problem stuff. So when you're drafting your problem, one of the questions that I had today was that it sounds a little bit repetitive. The problem statement is a little bit repetitive, but it is a summary of basically the stuff that you've analyzed. When you're writing a problem statement for a quantitative research study, Sidney, is there anything that you in particular focus on?
Well, I think it's really important to know that what you're asking, first of all, is answerable, right? And you can answer it by counting. Essentially, when you're talking about quantitative, and we're going to talk about a few variations of this, but the bottom line is that whatever you're doing is counting something, right? Using numbers to find out the answer. So if you start off in a place that you know what else is out there, it helps you prevent duplicating somebody else's research and not realizing it. It also helps you know what area you're in. And I think I have a slide later that talks about the library, but I'll give you the example. When you walk into the library, every subject is organized on a different shelf. And in that shelf, there's a specific, subshelf that has your specific topic. When you design your study, you want to know between what two books does my study go? Who do I talk to? What do I read? And that's going to be different for everybody's project because everybody has a slightly different area that they're focusing on. So once you have an idea of what part of the library you're in, and then what shelf you're on, and then what books you're next to, gives you a good idea of who to talk to. So when you come up with your problem, you're trying to find, has this been addressed before? What your book in the library is, where it goes in, and then this helps you figure out what problem you're addressing. Ideally, this should be a problem that other people haven't talked before, and it could be a very specific problem in your context. So for example, many times there's big idea research that's out there that he did a study in the States, and they found this is true with millions of people. But is that true the same way in Northern Ontario? It might not be. It might be completely different. And that's the kind of idea. You're looking at filling a gap of something that's unknown in order to solve a problem and do it with a quantitative method.
So in that example, if I just go back, you might make reference to what we know about that situation in the States, and then say something like, researchers have failed to address if that applies in Northern Ontario.
Let's look at an actual example. Let's go back to part one for a second. We know that because people are very stressed out and sitting in traffic in Toronto, it takes them a long time to get to work. And by sitting in traffic every day for potentially hours at a time, they're really, really stressed. Housing costs more. Some jobs pay the exact same as they do in Northern Ontario, but they have to do a lot more with a lot less money, creating people that are very stressed out, and that potentially has big health impact. So we know many facts, like how much money people make, how long they spend in traffic, we have survey data, and so on. Now, what we don't know, which is part two, is what that actually looks like in Northern Ontario. If you live in Northern Ontario, you don't really have to go very far anywhere. You never sit in traffic for 2 hours to get to where you're going. Usually it's 15 minutes, maybe 20, depending where you're from.
I still complain about the traffic, though.
Okay, but the point is that if you're trying to tie stress to the amount of time you spend sitting in traffic, you probably can't make that connection. People in Northern Ontario, stress-wise, are healthier and happier. They also tend to make a similar amount of money, but houses cost way less. They have more disposable income, which means that there's other health, social benefits, which is why Sudbury is one of the happiest places in Canada, according to a self-reported survey. Also the fattest. If you've been to Rib Fest or Poutine Fest, you know what I'm talking about. But that's the idea. So we know that some problem exists. We don't know what it looks like in our context, and we're trying to find out how do those similar variables happen here. Now, it doesn't have to be this example. It could be anything. There's quite a lot of research on every topic, right? Usually, if variables are impacting each other, if they have some kind of relationship, we could find something similar or find an example from a different field that we could port over and try to stick our variables into and see if it works the same way.
Okay.
Right?
All right. So, Sidney just sort of alluded to something that I like to do when I'm trying to design a study. Instead of coming up with all the stuff off the top of my head, if you look at previous research, you can model the things that they're doing, right? Let's talk a little bit about writing the purpose statement. So I know I just said that I'm not big on the significance of this research proposal is, but when it comes to the purpose statement, you need to say the purpose of this and then give the design. You always do that, Sidney?
I do. It's very important to link whatever direction you're going in and why you're doing it together, right? Because you want to explain why you're doing your study in the first place. That's essentially the most critical thing. Now, I know later, and I'll give you this preview, I know there's a slide that says that there's no theory in quantitative. There really is. It just happens to be that in medical journals or in nursing journals, they don't explicitly tell you the theory. But quite often, the theory has a place in why you're doing what you're doing, right? Now, what that means is when you decide that I'm going to pick option A to find something out rather than option B, there needs to be a reason why. And I'll tell you an example from a terrible student project that one of my students gave me. They said, we want to find out what the difference is between men's shopping habits and women's shopping habits. So here's two proposals. Proposal number one, we're going to go to the mall and follow women around as they shop and follow guys around as they shop and just observe them and count how much time it takes them in the store. Option two is we're going to survey them or interview them, and we're going to ask them questions about where they shopped and why and how much time they spent. Now, I'm like, there could be severe ethical issues following people around, especially if they don't know you're doing it, in order to count how much time they're in the store. But the real question is, what's the logic behind why you picked option A or option B for the same study? You could potentially get the same answers, either asking people, and that really breaks down to the difference between a qualitative study when you're interviewing them or a quantitative study where you're counting. But as far as why you're doing it, that has to do with the theory, it has to do with the design, and it has to do with the purpose of what you're doing, right? So you want to make sure that all those things align, that whatever you're trying to get makes sense, right? Now, we're skipping out of order, but I'll just say one thing about this.
No, you can. I'll try and follow along with the slides.
All right. So when we're looking at the theory, right? I'm sure you all know what a theory is. You probably talked about this already. But if you have two chemicals, right? And you put chemical A into chemical B and it turns blue. If you look at gravity, these are like universal laws. They're truths. They're always true, right? Now, this becomes tricky when we look at things that have to do with like human involvement, right? Human involvement, when we're talking about people's emotions, when we're talking about measuring social phenomena, it's not exactly always going to be the same. It could be. We could find out reasons why something happens, but we may not be able to prove it like a law. We could find indications of why these things happen together, right? So that really comes down to understanding a model or building a framework of how we could filter through a certain type of data and have something else come out at the end. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to construct a model to show how this works. That's where our theory is. Now, as I said, often the theory isn't explicitly talked about in health research, and that's because it's obvious the relationship between, hypertension and diabetes or morbid obesity, and one of the three top things is an obvious link. That's why it's just assumed that the theory behind it is that A causes B, and now let's look at what happens next, right? So when we talk about it in terms of like symbolic logic, and we're talking about that A equals B, and that means that B equals C, for example, when we talk about that, we're assuming that there's a theory. That's called positivism. We're assuming that the facts are a given, and this is just how it is. But sometimes it's really not that clear, like why people do what they do. And that's where deciding on what your theory is, why are people doing what they're doing, and then the next part, what are the methods, all filter from there. So if we really want to find out what's going on, we have to come up with a strategy to figure out what that is. And there's many different levels of how you do that. And most importantly, whatever comes out at the end is going to be very different, depending on if it's qualitative or quantitative, what kind of quantitative, and so on, right?
Okay. So we were going to talk about theory in a couple of weeks. And so I think I may have taken out the slide that you were talking about. I left this slide in about theory.
Okay.
But basically it was talking about the idea that you can put theory in different places. When you're writing a quantitative study, do you usually put the theory before the purpose statement?
Sometimes there's not even a theory because it's implicit, right? Like I said, most health research doesn't explicitly say a theory. If you look at social science research, in the first paragraph, they're going to say, we're using marks to decide what. And I'll just give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. If your theory, if your reason why you're doing what you're doing is to show the economic impact of the economy on single mothers, like a research project did, and you're using marks to figure that out, everything that you're going to do in your study is going to have something to do with who owns the jobs, who does the work, how does it work. It's all about work, right? But if you're using a systems of change or a health theory, then you're interested in other factors. You're going to study something different because that's what's guiding your research. If you're using positivism and you're saying whatever I can see is what it is, and there is no theoretical layer, then you just measure whatever you can see. You observe it. That's what you write down, right? And yeah, I mean, and that's basically the idea, right? Like we want to figure out, the first thing you want to figure out is what are your assumptions? Like what do we know coming into this and what is actually true? That's what the theory really is. Now, we could be in this to prove the theory, to show that every time A happens, B happens too. Or we could be in this to say the theory is a given. We don't have to prove gravity. We already know it exists. Now let's find out what comes next, right? Let's try dropping a bowling ball and see what happens. Let's try dropping something else and then keep on testing it in our own variations. Let's try dropping a bowling ball in Northern Ontario and see if that does anything, right? That's the idea. So let's go back up to the top and we'll do the slides in order.
Okay.
Right, I'm getting ahead of myself.
That's okay. I know it's exciting. All right. So we start with the purpose of this and then design. So design might be descriptive, non-experimental, quasi-experimental, or randomized control trial is to. And then it's really important to use verbs that are congruent with whatever it is that you're doing. So the most common ones are test, compare, relate, or describe for quantitative research. And then the verb should line up with the type of study that you're doing, right? And then you need to have your variables in there. Now, I actually have a question for you. I was looking at the Creswell book, and they were saying, and I usually agree, that it's a good idea to put your independent variable first and then your dependent variables. But we often see in the literature that that's not exactly what's done. Do you try and follow that model?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea to talk about what you could potentially change before you're talking about what's there, but I've seen it both ways. And that's a very common thing, right? Basically, you're trying to find out, like in Jenga, if you pull out one block, what happens? If you pull out a different block, what happens? Maybe it doesn't make a difference. Maybe it makes a huge difference, right? And that's basically what we're trying to do with the variables. You want to find out if this one thing is making an impact on the whole system, right? So often we're trying to figure out what that experimental thing is. Now, the rigor, the robustness of that comes with those study designs. Like, for example, if I'm testing how much chocolate milk can a student drink before they projectile vomit, then I would basically get a bunch of students and give them as much chocolate milk as they could drink. Maybe I'd have a control group and not give them any chocolate milk, and they would just sit there and talk, and then note the difference and stuff like that, right? Now, there could be issues like bias, and that's the reason why I go for a random control style, where I have like a double-blind study. I don't know who the participants are. They don't know who I am. I have somebody in between who's randomly handing chocolate milks out, and then we can gather the data and measure it, right? So often in drug trials, that's what you see happening, because that's the highest standard that there's no way I could even intervene, you know? And if you watch shows like Grey's Anatomy, they always have like somebody gaming the system and getting the drugs when they're not supposed to and finding out who's on the list and stuff like that for that exact reason, right? If nobody knows who's in which group, then the results are either going to be attributable to placebo if they work and this person didn't get the intervention, or they got the intervention and they showed success or not, depending on how it works out. So that's the best way that you could take yourself out of it. But regardless, whether you're experimenting or not, you want to make sure that like it says, the congruence between the two different pieces is there, that you could match up what you're doing to what happens. So you could describe the variables at one end, or you could look all the way at the other end and test. Now, often, if you don't even know what's out there, your first step is going to be how much of it is out there. And that's a descriptive process where you're going out and you're saying, I counted 30 students. The 30 students had condition X. 5 students had condition Y. That's what's out there. You're not testing anything. You're just seeing what the story is. Imagine if you stand at a pizza place and you look at what toppings do people order. 80% of people are going to order pepperoni. 20% of people are going to order pineapple. That's it. That's the whole study. It's a descriptive study. It tells you what toppings they ordered. Now, if you want to find out why they ordered what they ordered, you have to do the next step, which is ask them. Or how about you do an experiment? Every time somebody comes into the store, you're like, I could give you what you want, but for $5 off, I'll give you choice B, the pineapple pizza, and see what happens, right? Maybe you'll be able to change the 80-20 ratio to 50-50, or maybe 80-20 the other way, right? That's what the experiment is going to do. Now, in this case, everybody who comes in is getting the experimental condition, right? But we could also have a control group. People who we have the two pizzas next to each other, we don't say anything, there's no discount, and we see whether they buy it or not, right? And that maybe could influence how it works. We can compare one day of no intervention to another day with intervention. We could try to compare those populations on different days. There's a lot of different things we can do to try to design an experiment that would show us if that variable offering the coupon is going to impact the overall study, it's going to impact choice, and we'll be able to make some decisions based on that. Ultimately, the purpose of the research is to find how these variables are related to each other, how they impact each other, and what we can do in order to exploit that new knowledge.
Okay, so when you're looking at the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable, obviously an experimental study is the best at showing cause and effect, and a randomized control trial is the gold standard. But sometimes it's either unethical or not practical, to do an experimental study, right?
That happens a lot, right?
Right.
Like normally to do an experimental study, you have to have a really good reason why, right? So for example, my new research project is finding out level of nutrition and happiness in childhood. I have two groups of kids. One, I feed tons of food and they're super happy, potentially. I'm measuring their happiness. Two are children that I starve and I see if they're happy or not. Not ethical. Even though I can compare these two groups between the experimental group and the control group, ultimately that's not a variable that's ethical to use because you can't test on starving children. That's not a very nice thing to do. But what I can do is I can measure with the kids I already have, what is their caloric intake, what is their level of happiness, chart them over time, do a longitudinal study where I check in with them over and over and over again, and I find out, hey, this is the intervention. And think about it. We have many different examples of this. So, for example, Ontario has a breast screening program, right, where they'll check in with people over and over again. They'll do mammograms. They'll check with people's health and look at other factors for people who do get cancer if they were exposed to X or Y, looking backwards. Now, we can't give people cancer. That would be unethical, right? But we could find out long-term, studying a big population who gets cancer, and we could do a retroactive cohort study like that will go forward and check in with them over and over again. We could also do a cross-sectional study where we just take everybody, do a snapshot right now, find out if there's a relationship, interview a bunch of people, and then say, based on our little window of exposure, this is what we can tell you is happening right now with these people, right? So different problems require different solutions depending on what they are. But of course, it has to make sense in the context of what variables you're trying to manipulate. So again, childhood hunger, we can't starve children. That's not good, right? So we have to find some other way to get at that data. And it could mean that it could be very, very slow. I'm sure you know that the reason why a lot of drug trials start with animal trials because animals live for a much shorter amount of time than people do. So if we had to wait for people's entire lifespan for like 80 years to go by before we knew if a drug was safe or not, we'd be waiting a really long time. But if you have a mouse that has a much shorter lifespan and we can see the effect, it's like using a wind tunnel to test airplanes. Instead of actually flying them for 1,000 hours, we test it for 3 hours with very strong winds. Same idea, right? We just want to make sure that the two things align and we pick the right design to get at the variables that we want to do. Some things, however, can't be done like that. Like there's a study from Harvard on twins, and it actually takes 80 years to figure out what the results are. And they have to keep on meeting with the people over and over again and study them over a long amount of time. But that's not common because often we have limited time, resources, and money, and we just have to get in there and figure out, based on what we have right now, how can we find the best way to measure what's out there?
Good. That was really good. Okay. So when you're thinking about your purpose statements, these are the things that you should think about including. Now, as Sidney sort of alluded to, not all purpose statements are going to have these components. And then we're going to get into talking about questions. Now, in quantitative research, often your question is going to look very, very similar to, at least your main question. It's going to be almost the same as your purpose, just worded a little bit differently. So it's going to have the same types of components to it. Now, this is something that I gathered from my readings, and I don't know, I was looking for your opinion on this. This is what I've told my students before. You should either have questions or hypotheses, not both in the same study. Would you agree?
I agree. Yeah, it just depends what you're trying to get, like what the information is. Can we go back one slide for a second?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I just want to talk about the most important thing that you're doing when you're designing the study. The critical thing is looking at the relationship between the variables, right? Now, forget about the fancy research project. Super simple. Does the relationship, common sense-wise, actually make sense, right? Does one thing have an impact on another? Is it a causative relationship? Is it a correlation or something else, right? Many times, and I highly recommend this book called Spurious Correlations. You can find it on the internet. It gives you really funny charts of things that are correlated. They look like they go together, right? But this one is, for example, global fish consumption and happiness with KFC. Have nothing to do with each other, but it looks like the lines go in the same direction. Or an obvious one that I talk about in class all the time is pirates. The less pirates there are in the world, the more global warming. Maybe the solution to global warming is creating more pirates, right? So if you're designing a study and you want to find out like childhood obesity and number of bananas, they might not have anything to do with each other. We could feed a kid 1,000 bananas, nothing will change, or maybe they'll get very sick. But the point is that two things, it sounds like if we increase one, the other's going to increase, but they may not be related at all. So we really want to find out what happened. Now, also, the next part, the participants in the population, it really depends what we're doing. There's one critical distinction of what we're doing in quantitative, we're often looking for very large populations. So we can extract this finding that we have and bring it somewhere else. Now let's talk about this for a second. Let's say there's a universal truth that the longer you spend in traffic, the more stressed out you get, right? Maybe that's true everywhere. We know for sure it's true in Toronto because they did a bunch of studies. Now we're going to do the same kind of study in Toronto, but in Sudbury, but we have to force people to stay in their car for 3 hours a day. They're probably not going to be happy, right? But the idea is that because we found that because we have a very large sample in Toronto, we can extrapolate that and use it here, right? It has a connection between it. Now, working the other way, if we did a very small sample, we probably couldn't grow that to apply using a power calculation to apply to a larger population, because we have to sample enough people from that random population to realize that it's the same. So we're always mindful of how big our sample is, and usually in quantitative, the larger the sample, the better. The more numbers you have to work with, the better your averages will come out, the better your sample size will be, right? So, and look at that in comparison to a qualitative project where you basically only need to talk to a few people in order to get like really detailed, really rich data. Well, let's go back to the pizza example. I could observe thousands of people coming in and out buying pizza, but I can't have an hour interview with thousands of people. That would take thousands of hours. I could ask 5 or 6 people, hey, why are you buying the pineapple pizza? And they would tell me, oh, there's a discount. Let's talk about it. I could ask them questions like, tell me about your childhood. Did you ever eat pineapple pizza as a child? And see if those things are related. But quantitatively, gathering stuff on a survey, nobody's going to fill out a survey that's 100 pages long. You really want to make sure that your questions and your population are all realistic to actually get that data back. And that's true with the setting as well, right? So if something works in one context, you really have to ask, is this going to be possible to do somewhere else? Is it different in a different culture or setting? Or maybe it's a universal truth that's true everywhere, in every country in the whole world. If you have to sit in your car for 3 hours a day, you get annoyed, right? It has health impacts. Maybe that's true. And we can test that no matter what the population size is, we can test that everywhere. Maybe that's not true, right? So that's an issue that we have to look at.
Okay, I wrote down something because I really wanted to ask you about this. So our students learned about power analysis last year, and they're going to have to do a power analysis for their study because it is actually possible to have too large of a sample, which then increases your chance of error.
Right.
Right? Okay. All right. I just wanted to.
So a lot of that has to do with the level of confidence that you need. And think about it like this. If you take Tylenol, 99% of the time, it's not going to kill you. Probably, right? It's something that people consider to be pretty safe. We do know if you take too much of it, it might kill you. But a normal amount, the right dosage, is probably going to be okay most of the time. But you want to be really, really sure that that's true. So when we do drug trials, we try to make our confidence like 99.9%. So when you're giving that drug to 100,000 people, only one has an adverse reaction. Do we really need that level of confidence when we're doing pizza studies? Probably not. If it's 95%, that's probably okay, which means that we need way less people in our sample size in order to make sure that that thing is true. You'll notice if you ever look at a newspaper and they have a chart, especially around elections and stuff like that, they'll say plus or minus 4% of the time, it could be wrong, right? Which means that like 96% of the time it's right. That kind of idea, right? So you want to make sure that you're telling people what your margin of error is. I went to a research project, they presented their findings, and they said, by the way, our study, our intervention is accurate 50% of the time. But what does that mean? It's not accurate 50% of the time. If you do an intervention that may or may not work, that's not such a good intervention. Like, if you took a pill that might kill you 50% of the time, that's a bad pill. Like, if I take something, I want to make sure it's actually going to work all the time. And that's really what we're talking about when we're looking at sample size, right? How many people does it take to be absolutely confident that this is going to work in that population? Again, because of the number of people we have to survey about pizza, what toppings do you prefer in Sudbury would be a subset of the people who live in the city. We couldn't necessarily scale that up to be true in Toronto as well, because there's just way more people. And that means that our sample size would have to grow enormously. Same thing's true in New York. There could be other regional differences as well. But we really want to make sure that if we come up with an absolute truth, people really like pepperoni, we have to figure out how that scales up and what number we have to find. You could do a power calculation to determine what that number is and how many people you have to interview to get really good data.
Okay, good stuff. So I just want to clarify something. The number for the population doesn't go into the purpose statement. It's just what the population is. So for example, nursing students, the number is going to go later in your sampling section, just because I know people are drafting it this week and they haven't really gotten that far ahead. Okay. So let's talk about, I can't see the title on this slide. All right. So you kind of alluded to this already, but I just want to reiterate that it's really important whenever you're constructing your purpose statements to make sure that you can measure your different variables separately, because if you can't, then you can't show the relationship between things. Do you want to speak to anything here, or you want me to keep going?
No, I mean, and keeping with our pizza example, I have to know how many people come into the store, how many people order option A, how many people order option B, in order to understand how they work. If I only know people came in and 10 people bought the pineapple pizza, I'm like, does that mean all 10 bought it, or that was 1% of the 1,000 people who bought it? It makes a really big difference.
Okay. And this little script that I pulled is from the older version of the Creswell book, the one that's on reserve, if you guys want to reference it. I have the newer version in my office, which I just got. I find it a helpful book for some ideas, but you don't have to stick exactly to the scripts that they have. It's some good things to think about, but each study is going to be a little bit different in how you structure those questions. You want me to keep going?
Did you talk about the null hypothesis?
I think that's coming up. Okay. That's coming up.
Okay.
I could skip to that slide if you really want.
Great. No skipping. We're going to do it in order.
Okay. So just some key points when you're making your questions. Make sure that they're logical in terms of the relationship. I think we already talked about that a little bit. A lot of the questions in quantitative research are going to be looking at cause and effect logic. Maybe you can't prove a cause and effect relationship because of the things that we just talked about, but even if you're looking for an association among things, you're going to be looking at cause and effect logic when you're writing your purpose statements in your questions. Also, you shouldn't be redundant, so say things one way or the other. That's why we were talking about having either a question or a hypothesis. And if you word your purpose statement with independent variables first, if we have suggested, when you start writing your questions, don't start flipping the order back and forth. Always have your independent variable first.
So I just want to say one thing. I think that if you actually write the question and you do everything the way you're supposed to, it's quite possible that whatever you're researching has no effect one on the other. They have no relationship. For example, if I want to make it rain and I go outside and eat bananas, the answer I can tell you right now is going to be the number of bananas I eat has no impact on how much it rains. I could eat tons of bananas, little bananas, it will rain, it won't rain, it has nothing to do with it. Now, when that happens, it works the same way, it works in the same structure, but normally you can't publish research that just has nothing to do with each other, right? That there's no connection. So it's important that when you're doing it, you start out with a feeling that these things are related to each other, and then you're going to measure how much the pieces have an impact on each other. Or if you can't prove that they correlate, which is usually very hard to do, you like that they're statistically valid all the time, because usually that's not possible with a lot of social science. You want to get as close to that as possible and make sure the numbers run together, that they have some connection, that it makes sense that these variables are impacting each other. And then you could do a qualitative study, a quantitative study, a mixed method study to look at that relationship in more depth and find out what it actually means.
All right. I moved your null hypothesis slide there while you were talking, so you could talk about that.
Okay, so this confuses a lot of people, but it's actually really simple. The idea is that sometimes there is no difference in the relationship. So if I go outside and eat bananas, it will not cause it to rain. I know that for sure. That's a null hypothesis, right? Now, if I start out that there's no relationship, and suddenly I realize, actually, there is a relationship, that's when things get interesting, right? If I could prove that something is actually true when I'm assuming that it's not, that's what it means. So the null hypothesis is that you start out thinking there is no difference and there's no relationship. Now, imagine we do the experiment. I go outside with a gigantic Costco box of bananas, and I sit there and eat 1 banana, 2 bananas, and it rains. I had no idea this was possible. I caused it to rain by eating bananas. This is amazing. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe it's a spurious correlation. Maybe I didn't cause it. I'll try again the next day. And the next day, and the next day, and the next day. Just like Harry Potter, I can make it rain by eating bananas, right? So I'm proving that the null hypothesis, the hypothesis that I'm saying is not possible as a connection, is actually true. And that's when the alternative hypothesis starts to come into play. Then I'm like, well, if that's not possible, then maybe something else explains it. And you see this all the time, like, when people say, is it zebras or is it horses, right? Sometimes it's zebras. That's the point, right? Sometimes a very unexpected connection comes up when you're not sure why it's happening, and you would assume normally that it's not. So you could test for the null hypothesis. You could test that there is no connection, and then if you find one, then something happens. So that's the way the hypothesis testing works, that you set out to prove nothing, there's no relationship, and when you see a spike, when you see there is a relationship, things start to happen.
Okay. We're going to give you a little example of some questions. And when you're writing your questions, first, when you break your purpose down into questions, first you do descriptive questions, then you do inferential questions. So here is an example of a purpose statement. The purpose of this quasi-experimental study is to examine the influence of earning badges on student motivation and engagement in a first-year undergraduate nursing course. You'll notice that the question that's driving this study is pretty much the same there. And if we were to break this down into like individual questions that we're testing, first descriptive, how many badges do students earn? How do students rate on motivation? How do students rate on engagement? We'd probably have a couple more descriptive questions there. And then inferential questions come later. How does earning badges relate to student motivation? How does earning badges relate to student engagement?
And maybe when we did this study and we find that there's some totally unexpected variable that's actually causing this to happen, for example, amount of spaghetti students eat before coming to class, the next time we do this study, we could test that as the independent variable. I say to some students in an experimental model, you eat tons of spaghetti, the other person doesn't, and we see does it have an impact on badges. Because when we start out, we think these things are related, but there could be something else we're not 100% sure. So first, by descriptive statistics, we're just counting each different variable and seeing what's the relationship between them. And when we do inferential statistics, we're looking at inferring a relationship between them, right? What's the connection? And it's possible there might not be one, but usually if we are going in the right direction, there probably is. But we might find out that students don't care about badges, doesn't motivate them, doesn't engage them, just makes no difference whatsoever. And that would be the null hypothesis, right? Like starting out, makes no difference, our interventions don't matter, and we get we do the study and we find out there's no relationship.
And that's an equally important finding.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to check with you guys here. Can you throw in the chat if you have any questions? Because we're going to move on to a couple of little tidbits before we get to having some fun with your drafted purpose statements. But I just want to do sort of like a pulse check to see if you guys are all right out there. Bonjour.
I pulse checked.
You pulse checked? Okay, well, you're okay, but are they okay?
Kelsey says we're here, LOL.
Okay, awesome. All right. Let me know at any time if you have some questions. Still no questions. Okay. So after you do that, and when you're writing your proposal or whatever you're doing to present your proposal, you also need to state the relevance of your study. Because if it's not relevant, there's really no point in doing it, right? So that's another little piece that you need to think of. That's not part of the activity for this week, but I just want you to think about that when you're thinking about what your purpose is going to be. Sidney kind of talked a little bit already about quantitative research and sort of how theory plays in. So I'm going to, unless you have anything to add, Sidney, I'm just going to go to the next slide. Okay. Now, you sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I just want to bring everybody's memory back to previous research courses in terms of the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research. Sidney mentioned that usually we're looking for larger sample sizes, and we are looking for a truth out there, and we are trying to show the relationship between an independent variable and dependent variables. So I know not all of you are doing quantitative research. And that's perfectly fine. But when you're picking sort of which paradigm you want to go with, sort of think about the difference. Do you want to speak any more to the differences?
Yeah, I mean, like usually, no matter what your question is, at some point you're going to need both, right? Mm-hmm. Like for example, even if you're doing qualitative research, you need some kind of numbers of how many people you're interviewing, how many people are out there that match your conditions. So you may not be doing detailed stats, but you're at least gathering descriptive numbers. So in my paper, that I'm talking to nurses about their life experience with commuting to their job, I'm going to say in my first paragraph, in Ontario, there's X number of nurses. This is the total number of hours that they commute. This is the average. And because of that, I interviewed 6 nurses to tell me about their experience. Mm-hmm. Right? So we often have that component And if it really goes farther than that, it starts turning into a mixed method study, which is a combination of both. But in terms of actual qualitative study, you're really looking at describing why things are going on, and you really want to get people's experience, their explanations, right? Talking about something that you can't get out of a survey. Like, I could watch people buy pizza, but I really have no idea why or what's causing it. And often we find that a very unexpected connection, like everybody has warm and fuzzy feelings from their childhood about pineapples, which is the reason why it's driving that, which we would never find out otherwise. Nobody would check a box saying, I love my childhood pineapple pizza stories, right? You know, but if you talk to somebody, that would come out. And then once you find that and you start rolling into that over and over again, eventually that starts to make itself more apparent, right? And that's that. I'm not going to get into the qualitative part, but you get the idea.
Yeah. We don't have time for qualitative today. We're going to talk about qualitative on Monday. But so for the purposes of the real world, often we combine these things and do what Sidney was talking about, like a mixed method study, except for the research assistants in the course and a couple of, well, maybe just one group. I generally tell my students, for the purposes of getting through this course, to pick one or the other and to manipulate your background section and your problem statement to lead towards the one that you feel most comfortable working with. So by no means does anybody have to write their proposal around a mixed methods study. Now, some people are also doing literature reviews. A lot of the same stuff that we've talked about today applies to the literature review, because you can take a quantitative or qualitative approach to that. I'll talk about that a little bit more another day as well. In terms of data collection, Sidney already talked about the need to be objective and systematic. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Nope.
You're good? Okay. And you already talked about the idea that there's a lot of different ways to collect data. So just for those of you who are thinking about about a mixed methods approach, I have this example, and maybe Sidney can critique, that I wrote like just before class, where it kind of follows the same sort of pattern as if you're writing a quantitative research question or a qualitative research question, where you have to identify first and foremost what type of study you're doing. It's just that when you're doing a mixed method study, you say this mixed method study will address, and then whatever it is you're looking at as a whole, and then you have to break it down into the qualitative and the quantitative section. In this particular example, I went with quantitative and then qualitative. I don't know.
It could go either way, especially if you're not sure what it is that you're researching. If you have no idea how to get the information, maybe you have to talk to people first, and based on the thematic content that's coming out of your interviews, that will tell you what numbers you need to gather, or it works the other way around. You already can generate the numbers, now you have to find out why the numbers are happening. So those are the two sides of mixed methods. But whether you're doing purely quantitative or qualitative, you're going to have the same issues, like what do you ask and why, and what's too much information to ask and what's too little, and what do you have to gather. So those are decisions that you have to make to find the right variables and see how they're connected.
Yeah. And so for groups or individuals who are looking at doing mixed methods, I highly recommend that you take a look at the different types of mixed methods study that are outlined in the Creswell book. That'll be helpful. And you might want to have a chat with me as well. It is a little bit harder to do a mixed methods study than it is to do either qualitative or quantitative, at least in my opinion. So we're going to get into some fun. And so this is the part of the session where I want to say, I extracted your very beginning, and I understand that it's very beginning purpose statements from the postings that you've done. Sidney and I are going to play a game, and we're going to try and guess what type of study that you're doing, and we're going to maybe provide some suggestions on how you can improve that. I understand that it's just a very first draft, and this week you're working on refining it, so I understand it's not your final work. If you want any of this section of the recording edited out, either before or after I post the unlisted version on YouTube, just let me know. I haven't put anybody's names on the slides, but I just want to put it out there that you can ask to have it removed. Okay, are you ready?
Ready.
This is the fun part. Okay. Oh, and the Zoom thing has it so that I can't actually see what I'm trying to read here. Oh, so I got this student's permission to talk about this today. So this student came into the third year nursing courses initially wanting to do their research on the need to recognize disruptive behaviors in nonverbal dementia patients, such as pain. And they had a hard time finding literature. So they ended up going broader in their third year stuff. And then when they came to do their post last week, they were looking at this purpose statement. This is the ones that, Sidney, you did the highlighting. So I don't know if you want to talk about this.
So when I did the highlighting, basically I'm trying to divide out what are the variables, like what are we actually studying and how are we doing it. So let's look at what this says. The purpose of my research proposal is to assess and analyze. So those are the tools. Something has to come under assessing and analyzing. Now, the first thing I'm doing is what nurses perceive as nonverbal pain cues. So my question is, if I want to know how nurses perceive, and that's an important point, nonverbal pain cues, maybe there's a validated tool, maybe there's some questions I can ask around their perception of nonverbal pain cues. If I'm actually not interested in perception, but I'm interested in knowledge or I'm asking something else, then I have to change that word. Next, I'm looking at identifying if there's a need to initiate a pain management program for nurses who work with dementia patients, which is sort of asking a totally different question, and maybe it's contingent on the first thing. So maybe I have to know the answer to the blue section before I could work on the red section, and maybe assume that one is true. And then finally, I'm saying that they may accurately treat pain management. That's again assuming that there's a lack of information in the red box with nurses identifying which pain management with dementia patients, and therefore they needed another program. So there's several assumptions that are building on each other. Maybe a more realistic project is to focus on the first thing. So for example, I can go and ask nurses if they could recognize and assess pain in dementia patients, and I'll give them a survey and a quantitative survey, and they'll come back and say, on a scale of 1 to 5, how accurately do you recognize pain in dementia patients? And they'll self-report and say, 1, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea what pain looks like in dementia patients. Then you realize, okay, I asked 100 nurses, this is the problem, right? For some studies, you could even contact the nursing association and have them send out your study to every nurse in Ontario. And I'm sure as nurses, you're going to get tons of these studies from other people, right? Now, the question is, if that's true, then the next part where we have to make a pain management program for nurses that work with dementia patients, that works together. And the third part is, you know, that the last two parts are true, that's going to happen. I would say try to break this down to the simplest possible form and gather information on whether A, nurses perceive nonverbal pain cues, and there could be a way to gather that. And second of all, accurately recognize and assess pain in dementia patients. And this would be a good study to use a survey for, to ask them questions on those first two things in order to assess and analyze. You could have questions that refer to both. And then I would say in the end of the paper, when you're looking at future work that can be done, would be the red and pink boxes, right? If this study is true and we prove that it is by gathering data, then we need to make a pain management program for nurses with dementia patients, and we have to look at how they treat patients.
So you and I think, have a very similar understanding of this. If I was going to approach this problem, I would break this down into several individual studies. And for the purposes of this course, you need to focus on whichever one is actually a gap. So if you want to go back to the original thing that brought you to your literature review, which was looking at the need to recognize these things, maybe you would start there. Do nurses recognize nonverbal pain cues? If we already know that in the literature, then it doesn't make sense to do that study. But if we don't know that yet in the literature, then it would make sense to start there. Right?
And if we already do know that, then, and we have a literature body which shows that nurses do or don't know how to assess nonverbal pain cues, then the next part makes perfect sense when we're saying, okay, so we know that that thing exists. Now, do they accurately recognize that in dementia patients? So similar to what we talked about before of looking at our one experimental condition in another setting, here we say generally nurses know how to recognize nonverbal pain cues. What does this look like when we're talking about a specific population of dementia patients? Or what does it look like in oncology? Or what does it look like in cardiac care, right? And there could be totally different answers for those things because they're very different fields looking at the exact same intervention, the exact same question, which is the recognizing and assessing pain in different populations.
Right. And so it definitely makes sense to look at the other literature in the other setting, because maybe you could use the same tools to measure the things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Next, is animal-assisted therapy beneficial for individuals suffering from cognitive impairments? So this sounds like a quantitative approach, right?
Yep.
Do you have any feedback on this one?
So I would, like in this, the question is fine, but in the actual document, I would just try to make it clear what is animal-assisted therapy and how do you measure that variable. Mm-hmm. Now, you have the next part is beneficial. So beneficial for who? For the pet, for the individuals. Now, what exactly does that mean? Do you have a validated tool, or do you have some way that there's an issue? And then finally, I would say, what are cognitive impairments? What does that actually mean? Can we compare cognitive impairments from a list, from a group? Is it different kinds of cognitive impairments? And maybe by changing the different types of cognitive impairments and attaching the same intervention, which is animal-assisted therapy, to it, we're actually getting different results because of different kinds of cognitive impairment.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can make that more specific so we get consistent results among people, and we can measure if we're actually picking up on the real variables or if we're picking up on a confounding variable which just happens to be there and is changing our results, but we're not aware of why that actually happens.
Yeah, so I think your advice for the student would be probably similar to mine, is focus on a particular type of cognitive impairment and also define what you mean by beneficial, because you have to measure some sort of baseline before the animal-assisted therapy. So what is it that you're going to measure?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. The research purpose is to identify what programs are being utilized to increase education on youth suicide rates. I found this broad. I don't know about you.
So my first question is, when you say the research purpose is to identify, is that actually what you're trying to do, or are you trying to find out if the approach works, right? When you say increased education on youth suicide rates, what does increased education mean? Like, how are you measuring that? And ultimately, when we have a quantitative question, we're trying to measure every single variable, right? So let's start from the beginning. Identify what programs. We can make a list. I can call around. I can find out what mental health resources there are and put those into a list. I can count them. There's 18 of them. Now, how they're being utilized to increase education, I could call each one and I could say, what educational activities do you do? And make a list of those too. Now, when I'm measuring increased education, I have to have a baseline of where I'm measuring from, and the increase where I'm measuring to, right? Are you counting the increased number of organizations, increasing the number of interventions, increasing the amount of education, right? And ultimately, how does that impact youth suicide rates? Are the suicide rates changing the more interventions that we have or not, right? If the goal is just looking at the educational part, you could measure 1 year to the next if there's more programs, if there's more education out there. If you're looking at the next part, which is impact, that might take a whole different set of variables. So it's important to really define what the variables are and how they fit into your study.
Okay, good. Now, Sidney, I noticed that it's coming close to 2. Do you have to leave right at 2?
I do.
Okay, all right. So the purpose of this phenomenological study is to explore the mental and physical outcomes of infant skin-to-skin contact from a father's perspective. Qualitative, maybe I'll talk about this one on Monday. Okay. The purpose of this project is to propose a study that focuses on specific roles of nurses within the euthanasia process and what ways they should be involved in patient care. And then later on, somebody said they would like to focus on the significance of physician-assisted suicide among the terminally ill and the nurse's role in caring for these patients.
So with this project, this is kind of like a policy level thing. So, you might not, let's look at who you could talk to get this information. We could start at very high level. You could talk to, your association. You can talk to a hospital. You could talk to a health system, and you could look at what are the policies for this particular thing and how they come together. You could talk to individual nurses about their opinions, and sometimes change comes from the bottom. You talk to a lot of people and they say, we want to do X, and that's where it happens, or it comes top down the other way around. Now, when we decide the specific role of nurses within that process, we really have to define how it all fits together inside of that system, right? And we see this happening with many others as well. So really, we have to look at where this is coming from and what we're measuring, right? You have to decide what are the parameters around what data you're getting and who you're going to be talking to.
Okay, and that should be identifiable in the actual purpose statement when you work to refine it. Okay, and so this one here, I wanted to make the point that when you say the purpose of, don't talk about a research assignment, go right to the study, is to determine if there is a decreased risk of readmission following a hospital discharge, focusing on heart failure patients who have endured any type of intervention compared to heart failure patients who had not had any intervention. So my feedback on this would be, it'd be really hard to measure any type of intervention.
So actually, this is one that I've been involved with. It's a very similar thing to research projects that I've worked on in the past because we actually have this information in ICD-10 discharge codes. So we're able to measure the number of people who are admitted with condition X, and we're able to look at discharge and compare the numbers. There's many people that do this, and you can get this information through the hospital or through the LIN or through ICES in order to look at what these numbers are provincially or locally and so on. So this is definitely possible to do. It's a very good quantitative research project. Now, there are other projects looking at, for example, alternate level of care once patients are discharged. Now, to do that, so we're talking about the decreased risk of readmission. What happens after readmission? Are you trying to say that the intervention is what causes them to be readmitted, or is it follow-up care or something else? Now, that missing piece, what happens after they're discharged, may actually be the reason why they're readmitted. So if you look at alternate levels of care strategies, there's a lot of why that happens, you know?
Okay. The purpose of this quasi-experimental study will be to compare the effects of music therapy between individual and group settings on agitation and wandering for elderly residents of a long-term care facility who are diagnosed with mild to severe dementia. You like that?
Interesting. So we have to make sure that those things are related. We might not, by the way, I just extended for 10 minutes, so I think we're okay.
Oh, perfect.
I think the important thing here is to find out if those two pieces actually fit together. Now, as far as the music therapy, we have to have some way to measure agitation. We have to have some way to measure wandering and some way to measure music therapy and see is there a relationship between those variables. I think it's okay. We also have the mild to severe dementia part, which could be a scale that's done. And I've seen similar research with slip and fall, right? We have patients with dementia who are in long-term care. We want to find out why slip and fall is happening, and does X intervention work to connect those two pieces? That's certainly possible to do, but I'm not sure in this case that there is a link. And I would first, before I do the research, make sure that somebody in the literature talks about agitation levels are reduced by music therapy, wandering levels are reduced by music therapy, and then find out the relationship with this population between those two things, right? So I want to make sure that they are related. Otherwise, you're going to get a negative result.
So I talked to the student today, and we worked on this a little bit, and they were saying that the previous literature says that there is an effect, but the gap is that we don't know which one is more effective. So whether it is individual or group. So they want to have a group that's getting individual therapy and a group that's getting group therapy.
Okay, that sounds like a good study.
Good. The purpose of future research will be to compare the effects of familiar auditory stimuli, so basically the parents' preferred lullabies, versus non-familiar stimuli on the psychological responses of preterm infants in Northern Ontario hospitals.
My first comment is Northern Ontario is really big, right?
Yeah.
So if you pick one hospital, you'll probably get enough premature babies in order to do the study, first of all. Second of all, you want to make sure that this is feasible, it's possible to do, right? And that you're able to measure the physiological response, right? So there are ways to do that. Are you able to actually do that? And does it make sense? I'm actually going to email you a rubric that you could put your study into and find out if it makes sense or not, right? I'll send you 2 of them.
That would be awesome. Okay, so first of all, does it make sense to measure these things? That's what you would tell this student.
Yeah.
Okay. Henceforth, the purpose of my research proposal is to determine the best therapeutic intervention to lower pediatric anxiety prior to surgical or medical procedures. I find this one broad.
So it's super broad because a therapeutic intervention could be anything, right? So we know that one variable starting at the end is the pediatric anxiety. So we know that that's a thing. And we know that the time period that is taking place is prior to surgery or medical procedures. I would say look at the literature. There's probably a lot of literature on this already, and find what is out there. Just write them down on a list and find out what could we do that's not on the list, right? What can we do that solves a gap, or maybe there's a specific kind of surgical or medical procedure that makes sense to use an alternate kind of therapeutic intervention. Maybe art therapy is good in some cases, whereas some other kind of therapy is good in other cases, right? That's the kind of thing that I would look. Where's the gap? And this doesn't really identify why there needs to be a gap. This could be any therapy, any procedure may not have that in place.
So it'd be a lot more pragmatic, and this is what I would tell the student, to focus on a particular surgery or a particular medical procedure, as well as a particular therapeutic intervention.
Right.
Okay. All right. The purpose of my research proposal is to understand the coping mechanisms of males diagnosed with breast cancer. This sounds qualitative to me, because if you're looking at coping
Well, again, there probably is a validated tool that's a survey on how well you're coping with something.
Yeah.
And you could administer that survey to a bunch of people and see what they say. And that would give you a descriptive set of numbers that would tell you how people feel about coping mechanisms. So that's possible to do, but I would say that you're probably going to get much better data by doing a qualitative study and find out what they're talking about. Also, like we talked about before, if you do the qualitative study and you get back new factors you didn't know about, you can then survey people on those and expand your sample effectively, cheaply, and so on, because now you know what people are even thinking about.
My understanding too is that there's the number of males who are actually diagnosed with breast cancer is smaller. So it might be hard to do a quantitative study because it might be hard to recruit your participants. A quantitative study, sorry.
One of the issues is, who do you work with in order to get at that data, right?
Right.
And that's something that really needs to be figured out, because sometimes you don't have access to them, or it could be complicated at getting their records, and there's many different versions of how that could look. But if you want to actually interview people, that might be complicated. And you might have difficulty finding a partner who's willing to work with you.
Okay. The purpose of my research proposal is to explore the different types of diabetes education and what is the most effective to help with the self-management of diabetes. So when we're looking for something that's the most effective, it sounds quantitative,
yep.
Right? But if we're looking at the different types of diabetes education, that seems like it needs to be more specific.
So I think we'll start with the end part, which is the self-management of diabetes. We have to have some way to measure that, right? Maybe it's a quantitative question like, how well do you think you manage your diabetes? Then we want to find out what kind of education did you receive? And then look at people's responses. By matching those two variables, we could find out which one's the most effective. But I would say that to really get at effectiveness, we have to ask the right questions with a large enough population. Otherwise, we might just be picking up on the standard that everybody's getting. Everybody might be getting the same intervention. They might have access. If you have diabetes and you go into the clinic, they'll hand you the same pamphlet as everybody else.
Yeah.
You really want to get at, did you do something special that's different? And that's what's making the difference. And if so, you'd recommend we should do that with everybody.
Okay. So the purpose of this study is to determine whether yoga or aerobic exercise has a greater impact on cancer-related symptoms.
So I read this earlier, and I thought this was very interesting because this question takes a huge leap in terms of how the variables are related to each other. So we'll start from the beginning. Basically, you're saying either yoga or aerobic exercise has an impact on cancer-related symptoms. Maybe neither matter, right? I don't know.
Well, the literature, so I know a little bit about the literature review. The literature would say that yoga does and that aerobic exercise does, but we don't know which one's better.
Okay, so now we need to find the population who has cancer-related symptoms and get them to do both, or in a control study, get one population to do one population to do another, and then we compare them. Or we bring in an instructor who could do both, and we say, what are you more comfortable with, and figure it out that way. So I would say this is a good qualitative study. It would be hard to quantify exactly what better is. And then once you have a large population that goes through one or the other, then you'd be able to turn it into a quantitative study because you'd have who to ask, right? But right now it would be much more about finding out what are the factors out there in order to make that determination.
Okay. And so there's a similar thing below, but it's a literature review purpose, so I wasn't sure if you wanted to comment on it or not. The purpose of this literature review will be to discover the benefits of yoga practice in relation to management of cancer treatment and related symptoms. I think that my first comment to them was make sure the literature review hasn't already been done, and then assuming that the literature review hasn't already been done. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I would also do a literature review or add to the literature review the aerobic exercise to make sure that you get both perspectives, right? Like you're starting from the point saying that they're both valid, so you should show other people who have researched both.
Okay.
Right?
My goal is to add to the current research on the topic using a qualitative approach to the research to fill the current gaps in research. So my comment on that is, tell me what the gap is, don't just say there's a gap. I would like to determine the impact on education in these isolated communities and its impact on adult obesity. Overall, my question for research includes, does education and resources play a large role on the impact of obesity in isolated communities?
So let's skip everything and go right to the last sentence. That's the study, right?
Yeah.
We have two variables, education and resources. We could send out surveys. We could easily compare different populations and find out, are these factors? Or we could ask people, what are the factors? So we could do this qualitatively, we could do it quantitatively, but it's really important to start this process with a literature review, and you'll find somebody might have done this exact topic, but they haven't done maybe a certain thing. Like, for example, do protein-rich diets impact obesity in isolated communities? Because often there's way more hunting than you have in the South. Maybe that could be something that isn't done, and then you see by the literature review, looking at what's around it, we can identify the gap.
Okay. Yeah, and I think they said they wanted to go qualitative with that one. So I think that's why I included that. Do you have time for another one?
Sure.
Okay. This literature review will focus on academic integrity within the Bachelor of Science in Nursing programs. The research gathered will focus on why certain students choose to submit their work they did not complete on their own, while looking at why students choose to cheat on tests and examinations throughout different courses of the nursing program. Now, I'm not sure that there's enough literature out there to actually do a literature review on this. And this is a very interesting one because I feel like one of the barriers is that it's hard to ask students these questions if you're an educator doing the research. So I'm not very familiar, but I think there's probably a lot of gaps here. Where would you start?
So let's look at the actual question, the second part.
Okay.
While looking at why students choose to cheat on tests and examinations through different courses in the nursing program, there we have two different pieces. So first of all, we have why do students cheat? And on the other hand, we have why do they cheat in these particular courses? Like, is that particular course too easy, too hard? Is that the reason why they cheat? Or is why they cheat independent of the other thing happening? So we want to figure out, are there ways that we can connect those? Then we look at the first part of the question, which is why certain students choose to submit work they didn't complete. It's sort of saying that there's a reason why it's those particular students and it's not a common law that happens with everybody. It's very, very important when you're doing this kind of research to really figure out, are you studying a population or are you studying individuals? What's your level of granularity? So if I'm looking at morbid obesity across the population, maybe I could link caloric intake and obesity, and that has a connection. But if I'm going to individual people and I'm saying, why are you eating that hamburger? Don't you know you're going to get fat? That's probably not a good thing, right? So there may be personal reasons why individual students eat. What I would do is try to gather a lot of data and look at themes and try to put those together and say, I talked to 100 students, these are the themes that emerged. They're all anonymous, I don't know who they are, but it basically explains why these things are happening. That's the first part. And the second part is, when you did cheat, which course did you cheat in? I can analyze those numbers and say, in this one particular course, had way higher cheating because the course is too hard, or because people are too stressed out, the deadlines aren't enough, and so on, right? So that's how we can look at, not individuals, but as a group, what they think about X, why they cheat. Then we can look at, as a group, which courses they cheated in. And number three is, as a group, in the courses that they cheated in, why they did it. So those three things can be linked together. And again, we can find out the validity by growing the sample over time. And that can be done qualitatively or quantitatively.
Okay, that was my question, because it kind of sounded to me like you wanted to do a survey in that case.
It could be both, really. You know, we could even do a qualitative study and ask people in an interview or in a focus group or some other way to protect their identity, right? To make sure that they're not, and then we could then count, like, the qualitative data and count how many times particular themes come up and use a quantitative analysis of a qualitative interview. But I just want to point out that there's obviously big ethical considerations around here. And the way that I would conduct this study is by doing an anonymous survey, so nobody would know who the other people are, to make 100% sure that nobody would get in trouble by admitting to cheating. And more importantly, they would actually admit if they are cheating or not, right? Because if you ask students who you think are cheating, you don't want to self-incriminate them, that would be unethical.
Would you also want to do this? So this student's looking at doing a literature review, but if they were going to do a study, would you also want to do this on a different school than where you are?
Quite possibly, or get somebody who's not involved with your program to do the studies.
Okay.
Right? So I'm familiar with a school where the principal hired an outside researcher to come in and talk to their students and subordinates, because obviously there's a power relationship which people may not be honest if they have to talk about otherwise.
Right. Okay.
So I got to run.
Thank you so much.
Now, I emailed you 2 templates called Spider and Finer, and these are rubrics that when you're designing your study, in the end, you should have both of these things. Just give them a very quick look and find out there's obviously other ones, right? But you want to make sure you have all these elements in them. So for example, Finer, which is the first one, I'll talk about that and you can talk about the other one, is it feasible? Like, can you actually do the study? Is it interesting? Is it novel? Has nobody else done this before? Is it ethical? And is it relevant? And answering those questions, which isn't complicated, is going to tell you whether or not you should do the study at all. You'll see other ones like PICO, when you have to have a population and an intervention, right? Or Spider, where you have other criteria, but basically it's asking you the same thing. Like, is this new and interesting and is actually going to add to our knowledge? Or are you just doing the same thing 1,000 other people have done on the exact same topic, right?
Right.
And a good example of this is if you talk to psychology students, they're just doing the same examples everybody's done 1,000 times before, but you have an opportunity to do something in a unique context that's new and novel that could actually add to people's, knowledge of this topic, right? Maybe we don't know how these topics are linked in Northern Ontario, and your research could be something people could pick up and look at because this has never been done with this population, which might be different than everywhere else in the world because of unique factors.
Okay.
Right, well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we went a little bit over time.
No, not at all.
It was fun. I hope you had fun.
I did. It was great.
Okay, good stuff. I'll see you around. All right, guys. So that wraps up the discussion for today. We didn't get through everybody's stuff, but I'll pick up and I'll do some more of this Monday. So Monday we'll talk about qualitative purpose wording, and then I'll pick up where we left off with critiquing people's questions or purposes that they have drafted. If you haven't put yours up yet, or if you haven't had any feedback yet, I do get emails for the syndicated blogs, and I am checking the Moodle discussion boards, and I am checking the Facebook groups, and I will try and include as many of them as I can in the discussion. If you don't want yours discussed, just let me know. And if you were part of this discussion and you want something edited out because it was your work that we were critiquing and maybe you don't want that on the recording, just let me know. Again, you can let me know either now, or you can let me know after it's been posted. I can take it down, and we are posting this unlisted, so the reach won't be as wide as if we were posting it as a public video. Are there any questions, or what questions do you guys have left before we head out? Or if you're like dying to have your thing critiqued? Think about that for a second. I'm just going to say goodbye to the recording, and then I'll stick around if you guys have some questions. So thank you very much. If you're here watching the recording, again, please reach out if you need anything, and I will see you guys Monday. Oh, I just...